the Windsor framework and the negotiations that led up to it. And you and your committee have been very patient, as I said, that I'd prefer to come before you when we're at a point of conclusion. And I'll explain why shortly, but I think that bit of space for both myself and therefore by extension Maros Sefcovic and his team actually helped enormously in us ultimately getting this over the line. I'd also like to thank you and your committee for the reports that you periodically put out through this process, which gave a very well informed, but more importantly cross-party view as to some of the challenges and problems that needed to be addressed. And I know that helped focus minds on both sides of the negotiating table and again helped us move forward. So I wanted to put those out, and I'll make reference to the significance of those two things just in a second or two as I answer. As you are aware, I was the Europe Minister prior to becoming Secretary of State, and therefore I was involved with some of the rounds of negotiations at the point where the negotiations really had stalled. And you will know that perhaps the last couple of rounds of negotiations hadn't really made the kind of progress that either we or the Commission had hoped for. I think that a whole range of things, and I'm sure many books will be written on what caused the shift in dynamic. As I say, I think some of your reports were very, very useful, particularly highlighting the fact that there were actual problems created by the protocol. I remember at some of the negotiations we had, the position from the Commission and some others was the protocol is fine and there is nothing wrong with it. It needs to be implemented in full, including the bits that hadn't yet been implemented because we were in this kind of pause, and that if we just battened down the hatches and got on with it, everything would be fine. I think the reports that you put forward and the comments made by others highlighted the fact that there were genuine problems that really needed to be addressed. Plus that there had been water under the bridge, and when Maros and I first started talking, I think the first thing that we decided before really getting into the nuts and bolts was that we both agreed that this did need to progress and that it was well worth us putting in the time, the effort, and perhaps on both sides of the channel, the political capital to move this forward. We made our position clear that Northern Ireland's position within the United Kingdom absolutely had to be protected in all respects, and that we also both agreed that the principles underpinning the Belfast Good Friday Agreement absolutely had to be protected as well, but we also wanted to get this resolved. And so we started a series of periodic face-to-face meetings and telephone calls, between which our officials at various levels, including quite senior levels, met intensively and very regularly. The point I made about giving us both space was relevant because one of the things we decided early on was that what had been very corrosive over the last few years was this constant drip feed of briefing to the media with both sides of the negotiating table trying to justify their positions and trying to talk down the other side of the table. Massively counterproductive. So we maintained a policy of putting out pretty much joint statements, which are very anodyne and frankly lacking in detail, whilst we carried on with the work. Ultimately, of course, the challenges distill, and the technical issues that our officials had been working on, including working through the lists of concerns that have been presented to us by the unionist communities and the representatives thereof from Northern Ireland, formed the basis of our work. Ultimately, you distill down to the more knotty problems, which then got escalated to Maros and I, and we negotiated those down still until finally we got down to the last few very contentious, politically difficult issues, including some of the points around the Stormont break and various other bits and bobs, which ultimately then had to be escalated to leader level, which was when the Prime Minister and Ursula von der Leyen worked together on those final few really quite difficult and contentious issues. And ultimately then, as we saw with the signing of the Windsor Framework, we got resolution on that. The rest, as they say, is history. I think the things that really made a difference was the recognition that something needed to change and that the status quo was not working, and certainly what would not work would be the full implementation of the protocol. And the recognition on both sides of the negotiating table of that truth, I think, helped provide the impetus to those really quite intensive months of negotiations at official level, Maros and I level, and then at Prime Minister to Ursula von der Leyen level.
Well, thank you very much indeed. That's a very good start, and some of the points which you've mentioned we'll take up in the questions which follow. Could I just ask one other question? You talked about your relationships with Maros Sefcovic. I should say the committee is hoping to see him when we go to Brussels next week. Despite what you described as the agreement, which is terribly important, but between you, there have, at least in the public statements issued by the British government and issued by the European Union, there have been some slight disparities in the two. What significance should we attach to those?
Well, I think that on the substantive elements of the agreement, we are absolutely as one. I mean, it is inevitable that when you're explaining what is quite a broad range and detailed set of procedures, circumstances, that different audiences will want to focus on different elements and will be particularly concerned about different elements. And whilst the underpinning message remains consistent between the two counterparties, the areas of concern of our respective audiences will vary. And unsurprisingly, therefore, when the UK is explaining the agreement, we focus on the areas where our audience are most interested. When the EU does that to their audience, they focus on the areas where their audience is most interested. And I don't see any kind of inherent contradiction in that. The arrangement that we made was designed to kind of square a circle. And I think this is the challenge that we had in the past, is that we were focused initially on, from the UK's point of view, ensuring that Northern Ireland was fully and properly and permanently secure as a part of the United Kingdom and with its rightful place within the UK internal market. The Commission very, very concerned about the preservation of its single market, and that's where we had those kind of points of difference. I think what we sought to do through this was to turn what had been a conversation about theoretical problems into a conversation about practical problems and how we might resolve them. And that's I think where we've ended up, which is accepting on both sides a degree of theoretical risk that we think is very manageable in the real world. And I think moving from protecting against theoretical risks that might never crystallize to practical risks that can actually be mitigated, that's what helped us shift and ultimately get a deal over the line.
Well, thank you very much for that. Let's move on to some of the more substantive questions. Lord Hayne.
Thank you.
Lord Hayne's online.
And you're very welcome, and we appreciate your time with us. Can I also begin by congratulating you personally and the Prime Minister on rebuilding some trust with Dublin and Brussels, which had broken down, and the proof of the pudding is in the eating, in the sense that you delivered an agreed Windsor framework. Can I press you a bit more on the Stormont break, which many have said will hardly, if ever, be used, and that what really matters is the scrutiny capacity of the Northern Ireland Executive and Assembly, and in addition, its ability, ministers, officials, and the Northern Ireland Assembly members themselves, to be consulted What mechanisms detailed mechanisms will there be for them to be consulted on any new EU legislative proposals that will apply to Northern Ireland?
Lord Hayne, thank you thank you for the kind words that you said about rebuilding a relationship of trust. I think ultimately, in any negotiation, there has to be a foundation stone of trust. Otherwise, it doesn't matter what you say. If the points that you're making in the negotiation are not believed by your counterparty, there's almost no point in speaking. And of course, it was about trust in Ireland and in the Commission, but also, for me, and this is one of the points that I made very, very strongly when I went to Northern Ireland with the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, is we needed to rebuild trust across all the communities in Northern Ireland themselves, civic society, the political community, and the business community as well. Because I've always regarded this as a three-legged stool, and it doesn't work if you don't have trust in all three of those pillars. So I think it's very, very important we make that point as well. The Stormont break is an incredibly important mechanism. It's a unique mechanism that the Stormont has that isn't replicated in any other part of the UK because of Northern Ireland's unique relationship with Ireland and therefore by extension the European Union. And it's done to specifically address that democratic deficit. Ultimately, the arrangements like the Windsor framework or any other arrangements are done from the UK-wide government with a counterparty. But we are very conscious that to rebuild the trust, not exclusively, but particularly of the Unionist community in Northern Ireland, we had to demonstrate that things would not be done to the people of Northern Ireland from external powers without them having the ability to have a voice and for that voice to be really powerful. You say that that it would unlikely to be used. Of course, we would hope that it is not needed. We would hope that we could resolve any potential diversion issues before it was needed to be used. But it is there for a reason, and it is powerful for a reason. It is not envisaged to be used lightly, which is why it is set at least two parties and at least 30 MLAs. In order to make sure that it is something which is taken seriously by all parties, and because it is structured as such, the UK government is duty bound to take it very seriously, both in a political sense that if this were triggered, it's inconceivable that a British government would ignore it, but also there's a legal protection anyway. And as I say, it's designed for a reason. It's designed to be used if necessary. But ultimately, what we would want to do is to avoid creating circumstances where there is a necessity for its use. But as I say, if Stormont decides to implement this, then it does present a very, very powerful voice, very powerful and effective voice to the UK government to take heed of those concerns and to take immediate action, and to also seek immediate resolution on those things as well.
But even accepting that, if I may, the day-to-day reality surely is that ministers, officials at Stormont and also assembly members need to be consulted to eradicate it, or at least reduce the democratic deficit that otherwise Northern Ireland's legislature is bound to feel about new EU proposals through the single market applying to it.
Yes, that is a very fair point. Ultimately, one of the challenges is, and I know one of the criticisms that perhaps not criticism, one of the concerns that was raised with us during the negotiation is that these negotiations were done very much in private. I've seen, not just in a political sense, but in the commercial world, I've seen negotiations conducted by committee, it doesn't work. And there was always a balancing act about engaging with the stakeholders in Northern Ireland, political, civic, business and others, to inform the negotiations that we were putting in with the EU. But now those negotiations are done, we absolutely intend to make sure that we work and continue to work very, very closely with the political representatives in Northern Ireland, and of course listen very much to the business community and civil society.
Through the joint committee?
Yeah, so both through direct engagement, both through the Secretary of State, both through the institutions, and ultimately, of course, once Stormont is back up and running, through Stormont itself. That will inform the work that we do in the joint committee, and thus hopefully avoid the need for the Stormont break. But that we absolutely envisage close cooperation, coordination and engagement with Northern Ireland and the voices of Northern Ireland, as I say, political and others. I would say, of course, that the formal engagement through the political process is really only going to be fully effective once Stormont is back up and running. That's why we're very keen to see that institution back up and running as soon as possible.
And given that, would you see ministerial and official direct representation in the joint committee from Stormont or its subcommittees?
Well, I think we've got good mechanisms for making sure that we have that political input. We have the I have to confess I lose track of the names for the various formal engagement groupings that we have as part of the joint committee process. But we know we have a business engagement group. Obviously, the political structure has a pre-existing framework, which is Stormont itself, and of course we would seek to engage with that fully. We do, of course, have...
forgive me, but engagement is one thing. Formal, representative, direct consultative avenues and channels is something else, and you haven't really spelled that out.
So yes, we do. Look, we have committed to having the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister formally at the Joint Committee to be that voice of Stormont in the work that we do with the Commission. So as I say, that once Stormont is up and running, that provides the natural and right conduit for the voices of the political structures in Northern Ireland to feed directly into the processes. We will, of course, have, as I say, the business groups, and we will continue to have other forms of engagement. But ultimately, as I say, the political voice of Northern Ireland's people in this process can really only be fully put into effect once Stormont is back up and running.
Thank you.
Lord Chair.
Thank you. Lord Dodds, question, and then Lord Godson. Lord Dodds.
Thank you, Lord Chair. Could I ask just on the Stormont break issue, surely a role for a legislature is more than just saying no to something that's presented to it, especially when it comes to the area of a whole host of laws on the most important areas of the economy. What do you say to the criticism the Stormont break just allows elected representatives of the people to say no? But what about the formulation of policy? What about the development of laws? What about thinking of new ways of doing things? What's the role of the Northern Ireland Assembly, MLAs, in any of that in relation to those areas covered by the protocol?
Well, I absolutely think that the executive inevitably will and should have a voice in the production of ideas, of feedback. I mean, inevitably, that's the role of elected representatives to be the voice of the people that they represent. And the whole point of the engagement elements of this is to make sure that the Westminster government, because of course the UK government and the European Commission are the two formal interlocutors in this relationship, but of course we want to make sure that the things that we put forward, the things that we say, the things that we pursue are very much informed by the voices of Northern Ireland. those voices which are made, as I say, the conduit of which are the elected representatives in Northern Ireland. Sorry?
EU laws. How do Northern Ireland representatives in the Assembly develop, formulate and pass laws relating to the economy in their own right?
I'm not. So I think I answered I'll try and answer your question. If I've misunderstood your question, pull me up, please. I mean, ultimately, the UK doesn't dictate to the EU about its laws either. So whether that be Stormont or Westminster or Holyrood or the Welsh Senate, we can put forward. We have a voice, and hopefully through the Joint Committee and other perhaps less formal ways of interacting with the Commission, we will highlight the implications of any decisions that they might make. But of course, we can't dictate. The whole point of us leaving the European Union is they can't dictate to us, we can't dictate to them. We can put forward the implications of decisions, of ideas, and particularly because of the North-South relationship between Northern Ireland and Ireland, it is understandable that Northern Ireland might have a more interest or a greater voice, or whatever. But there will inevitably be decisions that are made by the European Commission that have an impact or implications cross UK anyway. So we would feed our ideas and thoughts and concerns in to them as an interlocutor, just as we would do with our membership of the CPTPP and other multilateral fora on which we sit or which we have an interest. When it comes specifically to Northern Ireland, of course, we would quite rightly listen to the elected representatives of Northern Ireland and feed that into the EU as well. So that is quite a natural process. The fact that the Stormont break exists is something which I would hope and expect will focus the minds not just in Stormont, but in Westminster and indeed in Brussels as well. And if there are decisions that are likely to have a significant impact on the people of Northern Ireland, as envisaged in the Stormont break, we would flag that. I'm sure it would be flagged to us. And as the primary interlocutor with the EU, we would flag to them to say, look, just be conscious if you're intent on pursuing this route, there could be consequences that affect the Northern Ireland. And that would be a stimulus to think carefully. But of course, we can't demand that they don't take actions. Whether those actions have an implication to UK-wide or specifically to Northern Ireland, we can't demand they don't do certain things. We can flag our concerns about the implications of any decisions they make, and ultimately, if they are having a significant effect, that Stormont break is there for a reason. Ultimately, like so many, it's an insurance policy, like so many insurance policies. We would seek to find a way of navigating that doesn't require its activation, but it's there for a reason. We put it in there for a reason, and we made it powerful for a reason. And like all powerful tools, I'm stretching this metaphor rather too far perhaps, it's not something that you would want to deploy willy-nilly, but it is there for a reason. It's envisaged to be utilised in certain circumstances.
Thank you, Lord Godson.
Thank you, my Lord Chair. Thank you, Foreign Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Wilson and Mr. Davies. Well, obviously, government is to be commended for its laser-like focus on restoring the centrality of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement in its renegotiation of the protocol. The centrality of that agreement, and particularly the East-West dimension, was, of course, fundamental to my late noble friend Lord Trimble's negotiation of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement back in '98. Much of the debate in Northern Ireland, perhaps too much of it, seems to assume that if the DUP were to return to government, that they then must be, as it were, passive recipients of whatever the process throws up at them. Were they to return to Stormont, and should they then find that the commitments made to them in the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, in the Windsor framework, including also in the command paper of last February, were they to find that those are not now being delivered, then they could still, if the joint committee between the UK and EU didn't properly address their concerns, that they should then have a sort of, as it were, a spare parachute that they could then also, on the second set of grounds, be able to withdraw from those institutions. Would you just comment on that and what their guarantees could be in circumstances that their concerns were not then being addressed?
Taking a step back, I want to restate something that I've said at this committee before, and I feel incredibly strongly about. I'm a unionist, and throughout my time in these negotiations, I always had that very much at the forefront of my mind, and I said, and I reminded Maros and the team from the Commission of that fact. I made the point that none of us can pick and choose, none of us should seek to pick and choose which bits of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement we wanted to protect. You either protect all of it or you protect none of it. And our duty was to protect all of it, which meant that it wasn't good enough to say the north-south bit of this is working fine, so let's leave well alone. Because I had spoken both to members of my own party from Northern Ireland, from other political parties in Northern Ireland, and to individuals, people who describe themselves as unionists, but not particularly affiliated to any unionist political party, who were all telling me that the east-west bit of this mechanism was broken and was causing real problems in the protection, the preservation of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. And the point I was making during negotiations is we either fix both the north-south and the east-west, or the whole thing is not working. And that required some really big practical steps. And I had that at the heart of every conversation, and I've said that we cannot dismiss the concerns of unionists in Northern Ireland. I'm not going to turn around to unionists, whether they be in my party or other parties, and say, look, suck it up. Your concerns are illegitimate or unreasonable. And I never did, and I never would. And that's why we work so hard to address the specific concerns that were highlighted to us about east-west trade as well as north-south trade. And to that point, we recognised that in order to get this over the line, there would always be elements where we needed to demonstrate a bit of flexibility in order to preserve the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. But we also envisaged that if those points of flexibility got to the stage where they were felt to be compromises, and the compromise is too far, there is a safety mechanism. No one is locked in to the point where they are forced to be passive. And I don't envisage, many friends, not from my own political party, many friends in the unionist community in Northern Ireland, passivity is not an attribute that I would use to describe them. They are passionate representatives of their communities, and rightly so. And the Windsor Framework absolutely envisages that they will remain passionate representatives of their communities, and they will have a voice, and they will have authority. And at no point, as I said on a number of occasions, we want Stormont back up and running, but that doesn't imply that therefore that the representatives in Northern Ireland, from whatever geography or community they represent, will suddenly lose the ability to be passionate defenders of their geographies or their communities or the interests thereof. And that is a golden thread that runs through all of these things, that it is absolutely right that representatives of communities have a voice, and a meaningful voice. It's not just shouting into the void, it's a meaningful voice. And that's certainly how, from the UK government's point of view, we envisage this moving forward. I think the Stormont break is one example of that, but short of that, there will still be very much the opportunity for representatives to have their voice, to feed in, to express concerns, to express the future direction of travel. And of course, it's it's in the it's the UK's duty, the UK government's duty, and in the UK's government interest to listen carefully to those voices.
Just following up a little, say a little more about the agency that unionists would have if they moved away. I'm thinking of my late noble friend Lord Trimble, that when he took a risk to enter government in 99, 2000, that the UK, and then that the commitments that were entered into in those very different circumstances, the commitments that were entered into were not then fulfilled, that he, on behalf of what was then the majority stakeholder in the unionist community, could move away without being blamed by the UK government. That's the question.
Yes, so look, I think you make a very important point, and late Lord Trimble, I mean, it goes without saying, did a huge amount on behalf of all the people of Northern Ireland, not just the unionist community, all the people of Northern Ireland, being instrumental in driving forward the peace process. Actually, I should have, at the start of my comments, I should have also paid tribute to late Lord Peter Brooke, who again also was instrumental in this, who I know passed away yesterday. And I think it's really important that everyone recognises this is not a one-way valve, and the representatives of Northern Ireland, the elected representatives of Northern Ireland, must have agency, and they must have a voice, and it must be meaningful. And one of the points that I've made regularly to people internationally who have an interest and were expressing their views on Northern Ireland, particularly those that invited me to condemn representatives of the unionist communities when they were pushing hard on some of the issues that they were concerned. And one of the reasons why I said I would never just turn around and say, I'm sorry, your concerns are going to be disregarded, is because one of the big risks that people in the political class took in Northern Ireland 25 years ago was to disempower the men of violence, the people of violence, and to take the power back into the political representatives. And I've always said, if we want to keep the power in Northern Ireland in the political representatives rather than the people of violence, then they have to have a voice, and their communities have to see that that voice is listened to and meaningful. And that was always at the heart of my negotiations. And as I say, that's why it is very much in the UK government's interest that we demonstrate regularly and genuinely that the elected representatives of the people of Northern Ireland have real voice and agency on behalf of those people. And that is why the people of Northern Ireland should maintain this 25-year tradition of empowering their political representatives rather than people who claim to act on their behalf and use other means for change.
Thank you, my Lord Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lord Godson. Lord MP, I think you had one or two questions here. Lord MP.
Yes, good morning, Secretary of State, and glad to see you back for us again. Just following on from Lord Godson's question, I would just make an observation as someone who was there 25 years ago. Both I and many others believe David Trimble was badly let down by London as a result of what he did, but that's for another day. What I wanted to ask you was specifically because there's many people here have rejected the Windsor framework for a variety of reasons. And in that regard, do you as a government intend to seek to negotiate fundamental changes to the Windsor framework with the European Union during the lifetime of this Parliament?
It's a very simple answer to that, my noble lord, which is no.
Right, well, fair enough. You can't say much, you can't be more succinct than that. The second thing is, does the government intend any alterations to domestic legislation to clarify or strengthen Northern Ireland's place within the UK internal market? And would such changes take precedence over our international agreement with the European Union arising from the Windsor framework?
So, I can't envisage. So I can't see that we need to So I'm going to perhaps come at that question from the other direction. So the starting point in all our thinking and actions is that Northern Ireland is an absolutely intrinsic part of the United Kingdom. I think it was in front of this committee that I said this, and I absolutely mean it. Northern Ireland is as much part of the United Kingdom as North Essex, where my constituency is situated. It is an indivisible part of the United Kingdom, and and its place within the UK internal market is it is absolutely secure, and the actions that we took, and this is where I'd come back. I'll maybe kind of give a bit of a supplemental answer to my answer to your initial question. But the reason that we worked so hard on the Windsor Framework negotiations the first time round was because it was Northern Ireland's place within the UK and the UK's internal market that was being stifled by the protocol. And so when I spoke to people in Northern Ireland and people from Northern Ireland, I was given numerous examples of practical difficulties. I was at a nursery, a plant nursery in Northern Ireland. I spoke to the lovely lady, family-run business, the lovely lady whose name eludes me, and I apologise for that, who explained why it was becoming increasingly difficult getting certain roses from GB, getting seed potatoes from GB, getting Jubilee oaks, and the bureaucracy and cost was meaning that GB suppliers were just refusing to supply to Northern Ireland. And she was saying that those are just some of the practical examples. Other sectors gave me other examples. And so that was the bit that we needed to fix. And obviously the negotiations which culminated in the Windsor Framework were always our preferred options. But I remind the committee that, of course, we put the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill before the House, which was, a number of you are very well connected, I'm sure, across the channel. It was really, really, really unpopular. And that's the proper traditional British understatement. Really unpopular with our interlocutors in the European Commission. And had that progressed through all of its parliamentary stages and received royal assent, I know that that would have caused huge amounts of friction between the UK government and the European Commission. But it was there for a reason, and it was there to address the issues that were raised to us from the unionist communities and their representatives about the feeling that Northern Ireland was being pulled away from its rightful position in the United Kingdom. I was willing to basically, I was willing, if need be, to cause damage to our bilateral relationship with the Commission in order to protect Northern Ireland as part of the UK, and I made it clear to them that I was willing to do so. I also made it clear it was not my preferred option, and that I would prefer to resolve these issues that were raised with us by the unionist communities and others through negotiation. And I'm very glad that we're able to do that because of hard work and a degree of flexibility on both sides of the negotiating table. But we made it clear that the bill was there for a reason. It was to address the concerns that Northern Ireland was being pulled out of the UK, and that we would have that row with the Commission if needs be. Didn't want to, but we would be willing to. And I hope that gives an indication of how strongly the UK government felt about maintaining Northern Ireland's position within the UK. And the reason why I said no to a renegotiation is because we got movement from the Commission that for many, many years the Commission told us were impossible. As I said, the starting point from their position was the protocol is fine, the UK just needs to get on and fully implement it. Over time, that shifted to the application of the protocol is causing some problems, but the protocol cannot be reopened. So we cannot reopen the text. It can only be about implementation. Until finally in the negotiation we got to the point where the Commission accepted that we had to disapply EU laws, that we had to make some really fundamental changes. And these are all things which at the start of the negotiation they said were not going to be possible. So we travelled a huge distance with regard to our negotiations, and the idea that somehow there was a significantly or even subtly better deal just over the horizon, I think is wrong. I pay tribute to Maroš Šefčovič and his team and Ursula von der Leyen for taking what was for them a degree of political risk. And I think sometimes we always assume the political risk sits only on the UK side of the negotiating table. I think they made some really bold choices, which ultimately have landed on the EU side of things. But that was certainly not a guarantee. And I think if we reopen negotiations, there is certainly no guarantee that we would just get more movement from the EU. It may be entirely feasible that their hinterland would say, "Oh, hang on a second. If you're renegotiating with the Brits, we want you to negotiate this thing back off of the table." Both sides of a negotiation have agency, and I genuinely feel that this was the best deal that we could get, that was also sellable within the EU, and it needs to be sellable within the UK, including Northern Ireland, and it needs to be sellable within the EU as well. This deal is because we both had to be flexible in certain areas for the greater good, which is the preservation of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, the preservation of Northern Ireland's place in the United Kingdom, and the practical protection of the EU single market. I strongly believe we've achieved all those three things.
Thank you, Lord Chair.
Thank you very much. We're going to have to make a little bit more progress, I think. Lord Hayne.
Thank you. You've been very clear, for reasons I fully understand and accept, no to renegotiation. But the fact is that a lot of the detail on the implementation of the Windsor Framework, let alone the protocol, still needs to be finalized, formalized, and implemented. We had an example amongst many of evidence given to us a few weeks ago of a small haulier who had to put, I think it was only one item that would be classed as red lane goods in his lorry, amongst 99% of which was green lane. But for that reason, the whole lorry had to be stopped and checked. Now, surely that kind of thing, along with a lot of others, does need to be sorted out and streamlined, or we're going to be back to square one.
Look, that's a good point, and it does give me the opportunity to clarify, and I thank you for that. So whilst I'm saying that we are not going to renegotiate the framework, it is quite clear that there are things that need to be done to make sure that the new arrangements are fully understood. They are by their nature in some areas complicated. And that complication is because we seek to simultaneously protect the integrity of the European single market, protect the integrity of the UK internal market, and also protect the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. And that slight juggling act across those three protections means that there is a degree more complexity than ideally any of us would want. So some of that is about a proper education and explaining job, and we will do that, and also
listening as well, I guess.
Absolutely, and where there are practical measures, and this is not about renegotiating the framework. Where there are practical measures, we will listen and make sure that we make sure those process points, rather than kind of treaty type points, can be addressed. Some of those may need to be tidied up through domestic legislation. We do envisage that there will be elements of domestic legislation that will be required for that. I don't know the specific case that you've raised. One of the things that I would say is that you will on occasion, particularly at the early stages of implementation, find examples like that where we can listen and learn and adapt, we will seek to do so. But I will also make the point that we have massively simplified the bureaucracy around East-West trade from GB to NI. We've stripped away a load of that bureaucracy and made it more simple. That's not to say it is perfect, and that's not to say there won't be frustrations at some points. I mean, I ran a small business which was entirely digital, entirely UK based, didn't really export. And as a small business, I'm very conscious, one of the reasons why I'm Conservative perhaps, I'm very conscious that well-intentioned bureaucracy does put a cost and time overhead, particularly on small businesses that don't have big compliance departments, and where we can find ways of alleviating some of that pressure for small businesses. As I say, without reopening the negotiations, we will of course look to do so.
Thank you. Thank you, Lord Hay. Lord Dodds, I think you've got a question here.
Yes, thank you, Lord Chair. Just on green and red lanes, we had evidence from a manufacturer just a couple of weeks ago who said that basically most manufacturers in Northern Ireland would put everything through the red lane, just for clarity. We've heard evidence that the green lane is effectively a retail lane for goods that can be guaranteed to stay in Northern Ireland. And green lane is subject to full 100% documentary checks, 10% physical checks. Red lane's full EU checks, even for stuff that stays in Northern Ireland. How does that square with the Prime Minister's statement that any sense of an Irish sea border has been removed?
Well, I think where so where we have sectors where there is real clarity that things are going to stay within Northern Ireland, I think we have made a very, very significant, or where there's clarity that products are going to stay within the UK. I think we have massively simplified it, reduced the pressures, and made and I think we've made that commitment by the Prime Minister into largely a reality. I think that where we have manufactured goods, the feedback I've had, and I've been willing to, more than happy to, to hear examples to the contrary, is that in many instances those manufactured goods tend to move quite freely within Northern Ireland and Ireland, so within the island of Ireland, and therefore that's why that treatment is the most appropriate. Or in a number of other manufactured goods, they're largely built to global standards anyway, which makes much of that discussion something of a moot point. So I'm willing to look at specific examples of where that is not the case, and I would remind the committee that again, because of Northern Ireland's relationship both with its proximity to the single market and its part of the United Kingdom, means that complete perfection in all instances is not something which is ultimately deliverable. But I think we have in very large part made good on that promise to eradicate that sea border in Northern Ireland. But I'm again very much willing to listen to, and if there are opportunities to adapt and alleviate any of those pressures, we will always seek to do so.
We are open to changing some of the rules regarding red and green lanes then, if it isn't working out the way it was intended.
So so there are certain things that we are seeking to protect. It doesn't say those. The Belfast Good Friday Agreement, Northern Ireland's place within the UK. These are absolutely top priorities for us to protect. If we can learn and adapt within that, of course we will always look to do so. Without being able, I don't want to go further in implying a commitment to change without understanding a bit more about specific details. And I'm not a technical expert on these things. I've got those people who are. And so I wouldn't want to go further and imply that yes, we can definitely sort out this particular problem without the detail of it. But of course, we are a trading nation. That is in our DNA, and we want to make sure that businesses, the Prime Minister is very, very committed to economic growth. Economic growth is unlocked by ease of trade and trade facilitation. So where there are options to do so, whether within the UK, between the UK and the EU, or between the UK and more globally, as a default setting, we're always going to look at opportunities to ease the flow of trade, because it's good for businesses. That means it's good for the Chancellery, the Chancellor, and therefore it's good for the provision of public services.
Thank you, Lord Dawes. Baroness Ritchie.
Thank you, Lord Chair. Foreign Secretary, you're very welcome to our committee along with your officials. And if I could move on to some of the detail concerning the implementation of the framework and the issues that have been presented to us by those within the retail and business sector around the issue of labelling. Now, in one submission that we have got, it said labelling, notably new, not for EU labelling requirements, have a 1st of October 2023 deadline for implementation, some 4 or 5 months away. However, in the absence of operational guidance across the supply chain, the October deadline is becoming increasingly challenging. We got that evidence also last week when we listened to the representatives from the British Retail Consortium and Retail NI based in Northern Ireland. So what is your answer to them? When will those details become available? When will they be supplied to the retailers and those in the industry? And maybe you could give us an explanation of those new labelling requirements for business. And also, what consultation have you and your officials carried out with business about the new requirements? Because there seems to be some issue with them regarding maybe the dearth of proper consultation.
So we spoke extensively with retailers in the period when we were negotiating the framework. There were lots of conversations that we had about the challenges, particularly in that east-west, for food retailers particularly, not exclusively, but food retailers were particularly animated about the challenges. And I know that there were some real issues getting GB foodstuffs in the shops of Northern Ireland. That was one of the things. And I know there's some friends of mine from Northern Ireland say, that shoppers instinctively know where certain products come from, and you can instantly see on the shelves if there are supply chain issues, if there are challenges east-west. You can just see it by which brands are or are not on the shelves in Northern Ireland. So we were very, very focused on that, and we listened extensively to the retailers. And look, not every retailer is going to agree with every other retailer, but the centre of gravity of the voices that we had was that UK-wide labelling was the preferred option, and there are some advantages and disadvantages to UK-wide labelling, and there are advantages and disadvantages to labelling only in NI, to say only. Our view, and this goes to so part of it is practical, part of it is philosophical. The practical point was that retailers were saying that they would prefer a UK-wide regime. Philosophically, I keep saying Northern Ireland is part of the UK, so therefore it seems to me logical that something we're asked Northern Ireland to do, we should ask the UK to do. So I'm very comfortable with having a UK-wide regime. The details of that will. In due course, or shortly, was that lovely political euphemism, which means
yes, because I was going to ask you there, Foreign Secretary, what do you mean by in due course?
so the right, there's quite a bit of detail in this answer, and I mean I'm quite happy to share it with you in writing rather than burn through a load of committee time.
Maybe you could write to us.
Yeah. So,
if there is more detail, it'd be very helpful if you could write to us so that we can cover some of the rest of the questions we've got.
So whilst autumn of this year is the start point, it will be phased through the next couple of years through to 2025. I mean, we have been talking about this for quite some time, including in the command paper in 2021. So this shouldn't really be a surprise to the retail sector. Of course, they want to have details. I'm sure there'll be details about size and prominence and that kind of stuff. And I'll make sure I get details of exactly when I will get details about those details to the in writing. But it's not just a sudden start. And as I say, we have been talking about this for a couple of years, and it won't be fully implemented for another couple of years. And look, I'm not a retailer, and I don't want to imply simplicity when there might be complexity. But this is something we discussed extensively during the negotiations with the retail sector, including those who said that labelling would be a good way of ensuring that their products were available not just in GB but also in Northern Ireland.
Well, moving on then, Foreign Secretary, to the issue for a long-term solution for veterinary medicines before the expiry of the grace period at the end of 2025. So what progress has been made to agree a long-term solution between the UK government and the EU?
Yes, well, veterinary medicines, I can assure you, was a point of regular conversation between myself and Maros, and one of the things that we discussed was the need for certainty and predictability over the long term. This was one example, like a number of others, where the kind of interim measures, kind of sticking plasters solutions, were okay as far as they went, but they really didn't provide the kind of certainty. So we've got a 3-year protection which covers us for the short term, provides some degree of certainty, and we recognise there does need to be a permanent solution to that. We are not quite there yet, I'll be honest with you on that, but this is one of these areas where we do continue to work closely with the European Union, and the point that Lord Hayne made about having a better, more trusting working relationship with each other. That's the kind of thing which unlocks resolution to issues like this. And again, risk-based, practically based solutions to this in what in many instances is a largely globalised market is what I would seek to do. I can't give you complete clarity and assurances at this point, but as I say, I think we've established a pattern of pragmatism in our negotiations with the EU. So whilst I can't nail down your answer completely here and now, I am pretty confident we will get to a credible, sustainable solution, because that seems to be the pattern on this and a number of other areas that we worked on. There is the pattern.
Well, maybe, Lord Chair, and through you, the Foreign Secretary, it may be useful if either you or your officials could provide us with an update before we complete our report.
That would be very helpful. Thank you. Thank you.
Just one additional question around the issue of parcel deliveries. Foreign Secretary, you very clearly confirmed today that the Windsor framework was not subject to renegotiation, but to what extent do the Windsor framework's arrangements concerning parcel deliveries, plants, seeds, machinery and trees resolve the problems that people encountered in the protocol, and do they leave any issues unresolved?
Well, as I say, we did listen very, very carefully to both the general concerns, particularly of the unionist communities in Northern Ireland, but also a number of bodies and representatives put forward actually really quite granular issues in some instances that needed to be addressed. And we really worked through those things methodically, including, for example, I've used the example already of Jubilee oaks, of seed potatoes, of certain other plants. Those were very much in my head because I remember the conversation we had with the lovely family business. And we worked through to address those. We worked through to address the provision of parcels, particularly parcels sent from private individuals to private individuals, to ensure that they were not treated like commercial transactions, and we didn't impose a commercial style bureaucracy on grandparents sending presents to their grandchildren through the post and those kind of things. So we worked through these issues. As is often the case, there are big lists of things, and where there are still some residual plants. I think there are certain plants which still need to be resolved. The list of which I can't keep in my head, but I can ensure my officials share with the committee, and we are working through those. And what we have found is the pattern behaviour of the EU Commission, Maroš Šefčovič and his team, is they are pragmatic. Where there can be solutions, they are endeavouring to work towards those solutions rather than making excuse for not providing solutions. So again, this is some of the kind of the ongoing, just rather boring procedural work. After the headlines comes the graft, and this is the graft whereby we're working through those issues. If there are genuine insurmountable problems why some products can't be moved, of course we work on those, but in large part we are kind of moving through these what had previously been identified as very sticky points, and we're seeking to resolve them.
And Foreign Secretary, finally, allied to both these questions that I put to you is the whole issue of common frameworks, because there's an intersection between common frameworks and the Protocol Windsor framework. And I'm also, I would have to declare an interest, a member of the Common Framework Scrutiny Committee. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering, what is your view on the impact of the Windsor framework on the Common Frameworks process? And maybe that's an area you might like to come back to us on.
Yeah, I think because that is a very, that is a very broad question. If you don't mind me saying, and I think that that's something I'd prefer to give a written answer to give a meaningful answer rather than what would have to be at this stage from a verbal answer, rather a kind of a stay in quite superficial general terms. I think it's probably better that I come back with something a bit more detailed and specific, if with your leave.
Thank you.
That would be very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Lord Chair.
Thank you, Baroness Ritchie. Baroness Alone.
Thank you, Lord Chair. The Foreign Secretary, first of all, welcome to the committee, and I do apologise for arriving late. I was unavoidably detained. I want to take you now to the amendments to the protocol made by the framework in the context of VAT. And so my questions are, when and in what ways will consumers and businesses in Northern Ireland see a benefit from the new VAT flexibilities? And when will the government and the EU deliver on the commitment to explore establishing a specific list of goods which are not subject to EU VAT rules? And what use will be made of the UK-EU Enhanced Cooperation Mechanism on VAT under the Windsor Framework Specialised Committee? So we start off with the general benefit.
Yeah, thank you. And this is, I think, a classic example of what, at the start of these negotiations, we were told with great authority were impossible, because this actually required legally binding changes to the text of the protocol, which at the start of this negotiation we were told there would be no changes to the text, and yet through goodwill and hard work and flexibility we managed to get some. And so the simple headline benefits is that Northern Ireland will now be on the same headline VAT rate as the rest of the UK. including on alcohol duties and other indirect tax policies as affect the rest of the UK. So one of the advantages, and I as a unionist feel very strongly about this, is that Northern Ireland is demonstrably, for tax purposes, for VAT purposes, the same as the rest of the UK. And I think that is an important statement to make. It also means that, and I know this is always our go-to example, and this is not an implication of my preferences or interests or an implied preferences or interests of the good people of Northern Ireland, but for example, the reduction of VAT duties on certain types of alcohol. I'm very pleased about that, and I'm sure others are, and that is now universally applicable across the UK. And the other thing, actually, probably a bit more seriously, is as we move towards more sustainable more sustainable energy generation generally, and domestic energy in particular, the tax incentives or the tax treatments that we apply to those renewable and energy saving products are also now applicable to the people of Northern Ireland as well as the rest of the people of the UK. I think those things are very, very important. And actually the other thing, and this is a little bit more ethereal at this stage, is that future decisions on alleviating tax treatments will now be universally applicable. So it's not just what is already in the package, but other things that we might seek to do in the future of the UK government will also now have that positive effect on the people of Northern Ireland. I'm also reminded by my notes here that the second-hand car market will receive support as well.
When do you think we might have a list of goods not subject to EU law? There is a commitment to explore establishing that list of goods. Are you saying that that's sort of underway, or?
So we are looking at doing so. I think, if I remember rightly, I had this conversation with my officials, and we certainly would be able to produce you an indicative list. I'd be very cautious in claiming that it was a completely universal list, because there are a number of areas where it is really quite depending on circumstances. But I will endeavour to get you, as I say, as complete a list as we are credibly able to do, notwithstanding the fact that there will be decisions that are currently in train within the government anyway about what else might happen in the future. But the default now is that Northern Ireland will benefit from any future VAT changes that the UK government will put in place, and that's a massive benefit. But we will look to get we'll look to get that done soon. Again, euphemistic phrase.
So is there anything else you want to say about the use of the new UK-EU enhanced cooperation mechanism on VAT?
For me, the really important bit is the consistency across the whole of the UK. I mean, for me, that's the really big headline. I mean, because there are specific benefits, and I'm very proud of those. But as I say, as a unionist, for me, the thing I'm most passionate about the fact is avoiding, as far as possible, differential treatments, particularly when the differential is detrimental to Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland were missing out on government initiatives, and that differential will now be removed, and I think that's incredibly important.
Thank you. I move on, and then I'm asked to ask you what will be the legal and practical impact of the Windsor Framework's provisions on state aid?
Yeah, so I think a really important part of this, which I know has caused concern, is about what's been described as reach back, and so we've resolved the subsidy control provision so that it doesn't and won't interfere with Northern Ireland's place within the UK internal market. As I said, this was always an incredibly powerful principle that underpinned everything we did. And so for the EU to claim that there is a risk to them from any subsidy regime that the UK might put in place, they will need the burden of proof is on them to show that there is a genuine and direct link to the Northern Ireland market, but also that there has been a subsequent impact on Northern Ireland EU trade. So again, that principle of Northern Ireland's place within the UK is at the heart of our thinking, and you know, it pushes the burden onto the EU to prove their case rather than us.
Okay, and the agreements state that the European Commission and the UK should publish further guidance on this issue of state aid and the subsidies that have a material effect for beneficiaries in Northern Ireland, which will be subject to EU state aid rules. Is there work underway to produce that guidance? Yeah. And can you give us any timescale on it?
Shortly.
So we are working on that, and particularly the circumstances under which Article 10 might be invoked or might apply. I can't give you a firm date, but we recognise that all these areas where quite rightly you and others seek clarity. The quicker that clarity comes forward, the better for everybody. It gives people time to plan, and also I confess it reduces the number of times I get asked awkward questions by committees such as yours as to when this report is coming through. So I will endeavour to get that to you as soon as we're able to.
Thank you very much, Foreign Secretary.
I think shortly rather than in due course would be a great help.
Shortly better than eventually, I think.
Lord MP.
It is.
Secretary of State, I wanted to ask you about the commitment to keeping an audit or log of all regulatory divergence between Northern Ireland and Great Britain arising from the UK or EU legislation. What steps are the government taking to manage the consequences of north-south regulatory divergence on the island of Ireland, which the government command paper states is inherent in the new framework? In other words, can there be a central point where somebody can go to see over time as how regulations diverge? And would that not be something that would be beneficial to business and to everybody?
You do make a good point, and it's one of those things that that quite legitimately people will take an interest in. So we've committed that the Office of Internal Market will specifically monitor the impacts for Northern Ireland arising from any future regulatory divergence. That will therefore inevitably mean that body becomes a repository. And Northern Ireland authorities can specifically request the OIM to investigate any concerns that they raise, and in turn the UK government has to provide a full response to any OIM requests or reports requested by Northern Ireland authorities. So that will inevitably be the kind of the repository and I suppose clearinghouse for any divergence.
Will because more than one government department is going to be involved, so will there be an obligation to inform this office of divergence, and rather than them having to pick this up randomly?
I'm going to have to check on the process by which whether it's passive or proactive.
Okay.
I don't want to guess on that one, But as I say, I envisage that ultimately the OIM will be the repository, whether there is a duty for government departments to kind of report in, so as it stands at the moment, it would be viewed. I would be viewed that requests would come in, they would be logged and held at the OIM. Again, I'm cautious of committing proactive reporting to the OIM because, again, this is one of these things where colleagues across government get terribly upset when one Secretary of State permits their department to do a whole load of work without checking on the resource implications thereof. So I wouldn't want to make that hard commitment at this point. But as I say, that's where I envisage it would sit. And I will check to see whether there is a process for proactive reporting rather than reactive reporting.
Look forward to receiving that because the committee is looking very closely at this, and we have anxieties that over time, if there is not a proper log kept where businesses and individuals can go and see, it could have economic implications and could stand in the way of investment and other things. So we look forward to receiving a written answer on that, Secretary of State. Thank you, Lord Chair.
Thank you very much, Lord Empey. Can I just reiterate that last point, Foreign Secretary? This is something which the committee has been very concerned with really from the beginning, that there should be somewhere a proper log of regulatory divergence right across the board, and we very much look forward to getting your further advice on that point. Lord Dodds.
Thank you, Lord Chair. Turning, Foreign Secretary, to an issue which was actually highlighted and flagged in the government's own command paper when the publication of the Windsor Framework took place, and that's to the reference to the removal of 1,700 pages of EU law applying to Northern Ireland, which we're told then will lead to only 3% of EU law applying to Northern Ireland after the Windsor Framework. So this committee has raised this issue previously. The European Scrutiny Committee has raised it on a number of occasions, and indeed has written a letter recently to try to get answers. Parliamentary questions have been put down. You've received general responses, but can I ask you, Foreign Secretary, and I don't expect you to list them all today, but can you commit to providing this committee, Parliament, with a list, comprehensive, full, complete list of all EU laws which comprise the 1,700 pages of EU law referred to in the command paper? And can you commit to providing this committee with a list of EU laws which remain applicable in Northern Ireland under the Windsor Framework? These are simple, factual questions. This was an issue that was relied upon by the government and by the Prime Minister in whipping up support for the Windsor Framework at the time. We would like simply to have the list. Will you commit to providing that?
Well, I looked at the commitment that the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland made on this, and I understand he has written. Has he written to this committee, or yes? It's I believe he had written to Sir William Cash's committee, and yes. I understand that your committee has been given an example. A copy of that letter, and obviously I'm not going to go further than the commitments that he has made on this. But I think it's worth again. I made this point with regard to tax treatments. I think it's particularly the case with regard to this, that some of those disapplications are circumstantial, so that it will be in certain circumstances there'll be a disapplication. So it's not quite as simple as just an A to Z list of things, but there has been a very, very, very significant disapplication of EU laws when it comes to the Windsor Framework. And you're right that we relied on that very, very heavily, and the reason we did was because, as I reminded the committee at the start of this process, we were told that these things were not up for negotiation not up for change. And we secured through negotiation very, very substantial disapplication in a whole load of areas relating to what is the UK's internal market. And in the small number of areas, the modest number of areas where it still exists, it's specifically because of the interrelation between Northern Ireland and Ireland. So in terms of giving a pretty comprehensive list of examples of disapplication, we're able to do so. The reason I hold short of giving a simple yes is where you say that bit about a full and complete list, and it's that last little bit which is the tricky. So we can give I would say a pretty comprehensive list, which give a strong indication of areas, but there are a number of areas, particularly when it comes to the functioning of the red and green lane, which would be conditional on certain circumstances, and that's a lot. It's not that easy then to kind of put into a list, but I absolutely stand by the very, very large scale disapplication of laws, from food and drinks, licensing, plant movements, some of the customs and bureaucracy around parcels that was already been mentioned, VAT zero rating, unfettered access for Northern Ireland firms into the UK markets. These are some of the areas where we've had large-scale disapplication. And that, as I say, I can provide a pretty comprehensive list of examples, but I wouldn't want to say this is the absolute be-all and end-all, because there'll be circumstances where we actually discover that disapplication happens.
Foreign Secretary, with respect, I've listened to what you say, and again, it's full of generalities and examples. But it wasn't anyone other than the government that put in a command paper the reference to 1,700 pages. Somebody counted those 1,700 pages. Somebody has those 1,700 pages. Why won't you give us the list? Is it the fact that you're afraid to give the list and refuse to publish them because you are afraid of the criticism that might come forth then as to those that remain in force in Northern Ireland across the economy there? What is the only other reason for not publishing it? Surely your refusal to publish the list, it only gives rise to the suspicion that you're trying to hide something. The point about it is that if you decide to make a big thing in trying to sell the Windsor framework of the disapplication of law, why do you descend into generalities and examples? Why not give us the list? Let us examine it for ourselves so that we can make an assessment of these issues. I fail to understand why both yourself, the Prime Minister, Secretary of State, and various ministers, in giving answers to parliamentary questions, will simply not come clean on the specific issue, a figure and a reference, which is made in a command paper of His Majesty's government.
I am very, very proud. The implication of your question is that we got something high. Far from it. Far from it. Remind the committee, the starting point of this was that there was going to be 0 pages of disapplied law. That was where we started with the negotiation. 0 pages with 0 disapplications. That's where we started on this. What we have accomplished through this negotiation is very, very, very significant levels of disapplication across a whole range of areas. The letter that my Right Honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, sent to Sir William's committee gives pages of examples across a whole range of issues. And I remember being at the starting point of this process told with great certainty that it was a fool's errand to try and get any disapplications at all. And that, you know, when we gave that figure of the pages of disapplications, if anything, as I said, that was erring on the side of caution, because there will be examples of disapplications which are based on circumstances which are quite difficult to list, and the explanation of that is in the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland's letters to Sybil's committee. So far from saying that we are embarrassed. The opposite is true. I'm very proud of the fact that there are thousands of examples of disapplication. Over 1,000 pages just on food and drink, for example. So if your starting point is, you know, you think it's short of the 1,700.
Just want to know what they are.
Well, as I say, I mean, my right honourable friend's letter, right honourable friend's letter gives a much more detailed examples than I can give in a verbal answer to you today. But the point is, it started at 0, and we've got it well up. We've got it up, as I say, and I think that we should not lose sight of the fact that at the starting point it was 0 pages. And I'm incredibly proud of the fact that we established the principle that we had disapplication, and then we're able to get such widespread disapplication across a range of areas where people told us, particularly the unionist community in Northern Ireland, told us it was making a detrimental impact on their lives, on their businesses, their livelihoods. So I'm very, very, very proud of what we achieved, and I think that this is way beyond the expectations of anyone that we spoke to at the start of the negotiating process.
Lord Chair, we'll keep trying.
Okay. I have no doubt. Lord Thomas.
The starkest difference between the EU interpretation and the UK interpretation of the framework is in relation to the Court of Justice of the European Union, because the EU has said there's no change to the role of the Court of Justice. The Court of Justice remains the sole and ultimate arbiter of EU law, and the UK government says that there have been changes. The UK's veto in the Joint Committee can only be challenged through independent arbitration mechanisms, not the ECJ, removing the ultimate authority of the ECJ in areas in which it would affect day-to-day lives. So on the one hand, no change. On the other hand, the UK side, well, we got rid of the ECJ. What change will be made to the Court of Justice of the European Union's role under the framework?
So, and I don't want my answer to appear confrontational, but in your question, you have blended two fundamentally different issues. So we have always recognised, the PM's recognised, that when it comes to EU law, the CJEU is the ultimate arbiter of their law. When it comes to the issue which is often discussed, which is the application of the Stormont break, that will be done by an international arbitration in the same way that trade disputes are often resolved anywhere around the world. And they are fundamentally different things. So for the EU stuff, the EU's body, the EU's legal structure does the EU stuff, just as for purely UK stuff, the UK legal process deals with purely UK stuff, and on the that area on that Venn diagram where there is crossover, where the Stormont break is applied, then international arbitration will be applied to that. So the EU does not deal with UK stuff. The UK stuff does not deal. The UK law does not deal with EU stuff, and where there is a crossover, that will be done internationally.
These arbitration mechanisms that are in the withdrawal agreement are always subject to the caveat that if a point of European law arises, the arbitrators will submit that to the European Court of Justice.
Yeah, but
is there any change in that?
Yeah, but that's different to the ECJ being the arbiter. Now, I mean, case law can be derived, examples can be derived in international arbitration from any one of a number of places. That is not my understanding. I'm not a lawyer, but that is my understanding. That is not unusual. That is not the same as the ECJ being the arbiter.
No, I understand. The arbiters are the arbitrators are the arbitrators,
yeah.
and the arbitration will be governed by any ruling that the European Court will make on European law. That's the position, isn't it?
That's not my understanding. So the arbiters can take points of international law in their arbitration, but I mean, if we're putting forward our case and and as I say, I'm perhaps drifting into into an area which I don't claim to be my area of expertise, which is international trade arbitration. But it is not, in my understanding, and I'm very willing to be corrected on this, is not in my understanding the case that an ECJ decision automatically directs the decision of an international arbitration.
Let me take another point. You referred earlier, when we were discussing state aid, to the burden of proof on the European Union to establish if any breaches of state aid European rules occur. A confrontation like that would obviously be settled in the European Court of Justice, wouldn't it? If the EU say the EU state aid rules, so far as they apply to Northern Ireland, have been violated, that would be decided in the European Court.
But if the Stormont break,
it's nothing to do with Stormont break. I'm talking about state aid, where you said the burden of proof would be on the European Union to establish that there'd been a breach of state aid rules. That could only be done in the European Court, couldn't it?
That's not my reading of it, but I'm willing to.
What court would decide?
If we're going to international arbitration,
this isn't arbitration. This is a breach of the state aid rules, where you said the burden of proof would be on the EU to prove it. To prove it before whom? It's got to be the European Court.
Yeah. So look, it's entirely feasible. I'm misunderstanding the nature of the question because a definition of EU laws, as I said, and we've always said, is decided by the ECJ.
Yes.
If there is an application which has a detrimental impact on this divergence, then that is an example where the break might be utilised, and in that instance, the decision will not be made by the ECJ. So whilst you're right that the definition of EU state aid rules would be made by the ECJ, if that were causing the kind of problem, and again, I'm willing to double check my notes on this and confirm this if I am drifting off beam. But my understanding is that if any application were to be having a real world and detrimental effect on Northern Ireland, that is the circumstances under which the break might be applied. If the break is applied, then that takes it out with the jurisdiction of the ECJ. That's why I was making the point about the break. So if
well, the impression that's been given is that the Windsor Framework abolishes the jurisdiction of the European Court in important respects.
I'm not sure that is what we've ever said.
That's what the European Union think of it.
Well, we've never said that. So if
you've sold it on the basis that the ECJ is overruled by the Windsor Framework, it doesn't apply, forget about it.
No, I don't believe we have said that, sir. What we've said is that the elected representatives through Stormont and through the Stormont break will ultimately have a meaningful say on anything that affects them. If there are decisions that the people of Northern Ireland and their elected representatives are very, very happy with, and they don't apply the Stormont break, then it is a moot point. But we've never claimed that the ECJ does not have jurisdiction over EU law. We have said that there are a small number of examples where EU law may still have effect in Northern Ireland because of our desire to maintain both the north-south as well as the east-west relationship between so within the UK and between Northern Ireland and Ireland. And what we have said is if that balancing act is causing real problems in Northern Ireland, there is a Stormont break whereby we can address those. The idea that we've ever claimed that we've abolished these things, as you implied in your question, has not been anything that's come from the UK government. If that's people's interpretation, that's not what we have said. As I say, the ability for the elected representatives of Northern Ireland to apply a break is the key. That is the key element, and once that is applied.
Right. So you made it clear that the EU are perfectly right when they say that there's no change to the jurisdiction of the European Court.
When it comes to EU law.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Can I just move on to another topic, and that is the engagement of Northern Ireland stakeholders in decisions of European law before they are made. Now, this is the role of the Joint Consultative Working Group, is it not? And you've set up certain sub-committees of the Joint Consultative Working Group. How far have you got with that mechanism to enable stakeholders in Northern Ireland to play a part in the formation of law? I mean, the problem with the Stormont break is that that's saying no after the law's been made, but what we're concerned with is making the law in the first place. So how far have you got with the Joint Consultative Working Group? Subcommittees.
So the specialist committee of that working group on the Windsor Framework has already met. It was chaired by Mark, and that is to review the progress in the creation of the structured subgroups. As I said in response to an earlier question, it is just as it is not for the EU to dictate UK laws, it is not for the UK to dictate EU laws. Now, obviously, we would want to feed in the thoughts and opinions of the people of Northern Ireland, both through Stormont and also through the JCWG, and this is to help inform the decisions as they could potentially have an effect on Northern Ireland because, as I say, we wanted to protect the ability for Northern Ireland to easily transact business with Ireland and therefore, by extension, with the wider EU. But as I say, it's not for the UK to dictate to another lawmaking body about their laws.
How is the group to operate? Is it to contain civil servants from Northern Ireland, for example, who know what they're talking about? Or will it hold hearings at which stakeholders can give evidence about what they think of a proposal by the EU to bring in a new directive or whatever?
I think the composition of the groups will, form follows function. It should be quite Bauhaus in its design. So form follows function. So I don't think there's any incentive for us to be prescriptive or limiting on the composition of the subgroups.
So what does that mean? That Northern Ireland people will take part or will not?
Well, they will, by definitely. They'll take part either through their business representative groups or their elected representatives. The point is that these groups are designed to harvest the experience and the views of the people of Northern Ireland. That's why they exist, and they are designed to make sure that there's a structured and credible way of feeding views and ideas and concerns into the decision makers on EU law.
Well, that's exactly it. I'm asking about the structure. What is the structure?
Well, as I say, the structure will, so form follows function. So the structure will be what we view to be the most effective way of harvesting those views and translating those views. So rather than saying, oh, it has to be like this, what we're saying is it has to perform this, and form follows function. So the committee that Mark chaired was looking at the best way of harvesting the views of political representatives, business representatives, community representatives, in order to most effectively feed on.
No decision has been made about such a structure.
Well, no, because we want to make sure it's effective. So I would prefer to be flexible in its structure in order to protect its effectiveness, rather than be dogmatic about its structure and in doing so undermine its effectiveness.
And will this committee be informed of the proposed structure before it is finalised?
I would think that's inevitable, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Foreign Secretary. There's one question which we were going to ask, and which we've now run out of time. It would be very helpful if you were able to write to us, is about the implications of the Windsor Framework for the wider UK-EU relationship, and in particular what areas of cooperation can now be accelerated, given that there is agreement on the Windsor Framework. That would be very helpful. There are one or two other pieces of work which you very helpfully said that you would be able to write to us about. One was answer to questions from Baroness Ritchie about plants, and also about the link with common frameworks, which I think you have very kindly agreed to write to us about. You've also agreed to write to us about with a list of goods not subject to EU VAT. That was in relation to another question. And also the role of the OIM on divergence. I know that was something which is very much a concern of the committee as a whole. And finally, I think you promised to send us, and I think I quote correctly, a quote pretty comprehensive unquote list of the 1,700 pages of EU law, and that would be very helpful too. But on behalf of all of us, can I thank you and your officials, but thank you very much indeed for the evidence you've given us. We are 1 minute or 2 minutes over the hard deadline of 1:15, but we're very grateful to you for coming and giving evidence to us, and I declare this formal session of the committee closed. Thank you.